Okay, so we are going to talk about monorepos today. And I even noticed that one of the questions that you guys have already asked is, using monorepos, in production environments, or for production environments in sort of an enterprise company where, there's a lot more considerations and things that we have to think about. But they can end up being either sort of a nightmare or they can end up being really useful. So I'll try to answer that question a little bit as I go through this. Hopefully the presentation itself sort of gives you a window into how we use it at Rally and how I've used it in the past as well. So I'm Alex Jewell. I'm a UI software engineer at Rally. We're hiring. So if you guys are looking, definitely let me know. Previously worked at Fiverr. I was at Raise.com. Back in the day before it was Raise, it was Coupon Trade. There was like 15 of us. Then I worked at Lightbank before that for a while. So I have some other interests. I'm in the blockchain markets, economics, trading. I have an Instagram account, Best Food Alex. So if you're curious of where to eat in Chicago, really into politics, social justice, and change. And then I have 2 dogs, Chicken and Waffles, the brunch crew. All right, so we're going to talk about circle of life. How do we end up here? We're going to talk about the tech stack, obviously. We're going to go through Lerna pretty extensively because that's mostly what I work with. We're going to look at Yarn Workspaces and how that improves dependency. Then we're going to look at the future. And finally, got to have those closing thoughts. So the circle of life, monorepos, monoliths. Now they can also be called multi-repos. A lot of different ways to say the same thing. We began back in the day with monoliths. We had these early web apps that were often MVM. You had Ruby on Rails, maybe you had some huge object style JavaScript files, vanilla JS, or you had a bunch of jQuery in there with your views, and it was sort of a mess. It was really easy to break something else somewhere else, and you had a lot of risk in release. So what ended up happening, the natural trend was the move to microservices, and this became really possible with a lot of JavaScript libraries that allowed us to really run apps differently on the front end and more powerfully. And so the trend in technology allowed us to also fix some of the problems we were having with monoliths. And so you had React and Angular giving us the freedom to separate out services. And this broke up our work also and sort of organized it so that, especially on larger teams, you could have people working on different apps, different services, and also managing versions of things so you could properly test and make sure that a new version wouldn't break something before that new version ended up in production. However, this sort of ended up being release hell. If you're having to open PRs to upgrade versions along the line of 6 or 7 services, microservices, that's going to take forever. And this is something that we ran into a lot at Fiverr, where we would have like a handful of services. You're opening PRs, you're having to build, release, watch it build again, wait for it to finish, wait for the new version to be available, get the new version in your next package, and on down the line. And this ended up being, like I said, release hell. And so where we are now is somewhat in between microservices and my monorepos. I think that a lot of different places still have a lot of microservices. They're trying to manage, what should be its own service and what should be sort of something that's monolithic, because we obviously can't make every little thing. We can't make an individual button and app somewhere that you're upgrading versions every time somebody changes a little thing. So what we've ended up doing at Rally in terms of front end, and in a lot of the projects that I've worked on, at least, monorepos have become extremely useful. And so it allows us to separate out our services and organize our code in a lot of the ways that microservices did, but still work quickly and efficiently because all of those separate packages are inside the same repo. So we're going to talk about how that sort of works. So what's the tech stack here? And I hope you guys enjoy this lovely Venn diagram. It kind of looks like a war between Yarn and NPM, just like letting off their animals at each other, with React like in the middle. So Lerna is what we use a lot. It's the preferred tool for efficiently managing monorepos. And so what it does is it kind of bootstraps the complex map of dependencies together for all of those shared packages within the repo. And we're going to go through a pretty good example with this. What Yarn Workspaces adds to the table, and a lot of people are probably looking at this like, oh, you've got NPM and Yarn together. How does that work? What Yarn's new solution for monorepos Workspaces does is it allows you to install dependencies across the repo rather than for individual packages. Right now with Lerna, each individual package still has its own node modules directory. This is obviously not super efficient. It works really well, but if we can make it better with something like Yarn Workspaces, that's not always a bad idea. This cuts down on dependency redundancy, say that 100 times fast, and improves performance. And then obviously, this is a React meetup. So we'll be looking at how this works specifically in React projects. But just want to make sure that you guys know Lerna and Yarn are not obviously React specific. All right, so this is our, there's a couple more notes actually that I was going to make here. So there are some ways that you could kind of make these things work. NPM link was one of them, and under the hood, NPM link is still being used for something like Lerna. It wasn't a viable solution outside of your local environment, and even then it was pretty cumbersome. I'm also going to note too with Yarn Workspaces, and this is one of the reasons why I'm not using it super frequently yet, is because it doesn't actually play super nicely when you're using NPM, Lerna, and create React app together. Now, I've seen some people online posting like ways that they've kind of hacked it together using like the create React app rewired, but I haven't necessarily needed Yarn Workspaces so desperately that I've gone through the effort to do that for some projects. Okay, so let's talk about Lerna. Note we're using MPX here as the package runner because it's a little bit more efficient. We're not waiting for things to, we're not waiting for everything to install. We're not having to install things globally. So it's pretty nice. Like otherwise you have to install Lerna globally, and that starts to get a little messy. Okay, so I'm calling this project we're going to work on Trinity. You'll see why. So we make a directory, Lerna Trinity, and then we go into it. And then inside of that package, npx Lerna init. And that's really simple. You can see it over here. It initializes kind of what Lerna needs, which is essentially going to be Lerna.json here. And we'll go into details on what that does. You create your packages. So like in this packages directory, we'll go into detail on that, is each package that Lerna manages the dependencies for, bootstraps everything together. So your root directory may eventually look something like this, where you've got your storybook, you have storybook, got your packages, your actual apps, libraries, live, scripts. This is, deployment stuff, Webpack for all of your apps. Then, of course, you Lerna.json and your package.json and whatever other dot files, if you've got ESLint or TSLint or anything like that, git ignore. So, and so let's look at the example. And so this is what I was talking about in reference to packages. So let's say let's pretend for a moment that we've got a new project coming down in the pipeline. And this is actually kind of based on a real project that I've worked on. So let's say that you have a new marketing initiative coming through, and let's say you need 3 apps that are going to be extremely similar for slightly different purposes that kind of mean that they're going to be accessible in different ways to different audiences. and have enough differences where you're obviously not just making it one app. So this is sort of the perfect example of when to use Lerna. Say we have a partner site that's maybe for like brand partners for that campaign. Let's say we have a marketing app that's like the landing page for it, to like funnel people to convert them. And then let's say we have a member site, and that's a version of the app that's what we're trying to sell them on, right? And so when you're a member, you have a whole different experience. And then we also maybe have some libraries. Now, no, like these are just naming conventions that I've decided. These are not Lerna specific. It's just sort of for us to know, like, okay, these are our three apps and these are our three components. So that I just wanted to note that. But say you have like some shared components. Let's say maybe your fetcher stuff is in here, and then maybe you have like a bunch of utilities and stuff that you don't want clouding the uses of the other things, and maybe they're shared between them, right? So maybe like you have colors in here or something. Okay. So this is a really good way to show how a monorepo might work with Lerna in the real world. And so out of your library components, you have components that are exported, and then you're able to import them into your apps. So each package has its own package JSON. It's literally its own runnable app. It's a standalone React package, but there's a few key differences. The other packages it shares components with should be dev dependencies, and the external npm dependencies are going to be peer dependencies. And this is how Lerna decides how to bootstrap everything together in the right order. And so we kind of know that like these apps are going to have a similar design, maybe some of the same components, maybe even some of the same endpoints, right? And that's why we have the library fetcher, utilities, etc. All right. So common commands, and this is sort of like your day-to-day use of Lerna, like how some of this stuff works. You're going to be doing Lerna clean and Lerna bootstrap constantly. Sometimes when something's not working, it's good to just clean it, as that is the case for most things in life, right? So there's different ways to manage versioning. This is one of the biggest questions that comes up for when people are learning about Lerna. There's a way to do independent versioning, and this is that flag that you see here with a init. It allows you to manage or even publish manage and publish then, because you're doing it this way, your packages with independent versions, rather than the one single version for the whole repo, which is what happens by default. Lerna allows you to add packages by name, either to the repo overall or scope to a specific package. So you can add a certain dependency for everything, or for the certain, just one of the apps. And so, like I said, too, sometimes it's good to just clean something when things are going awry. Notes about publishing. This isn't something that affects us too often, and this is like a good point to bring up in reference to a more enterprise solution. Obviously, when you're working with something like Jenkins and you have a Jenkins file, creating Docker images, etc., maybe publishing to like your internally private repositories where it's scoped using like Artifactory or something. Your Jenkins file is kind of handling that process, right? But say you're just doing something on your own, you don't really need all of that. Lerna can handle the publishing for your registry. So like I said, we use Artifactory and have some pretty lengthy Jenkins files to defend our stages, but you can handle that process just from Lerna if your needs are simpler. And so Lerna gives you from Git, which publishes packages tagged in the current commit, or from package, which publishes packages out of date in the registry. And these are things that I don't have a lot of experience with personally, but there's a lot of resources online of how to use those, and they're pretty good for personal use. Okay, so importing your components, and this is where you see really how simple this is. Like once you kind of set it up a certain way, and you know how to npm run bootstrap to kind of get things going and run your app. So we import things the same way that you would from any other scope package. That scope package just happens to be in the same local repo you're working with. And so you can easily see how this cuts out all of the release process that sort of drains people's lives when you're working with microservices. So if you've bundled your library package correctly with Webpack entries from where your components are being exported, and you've included the scoped package and dev dependencies in your actual app package JSON, you'll be able to import them normally. Some couple important notes. You want to set up ways in the root app to run and watch, obviously, the current application while you're developing, as well as watch relevant library packages in other tabs. So I like to add a script for each app in my root package JSON, like the following. And so what this allows me to do is say, like, npm run partner. This executes npm start scope to the certain package using Lerna underneath. Okay, so let's talk about Yarn Workspaces a bit and how this can improve your use case just to make things a little bit more efficient. The major benefit of using Yarn Workspaces with Lerna is that, like I kind of mentioned before, is you only have one node modules directory to support all of your packages. Lerna does a great job of managing how to bootstrap your dependencies and packages together, but still ultimately has way too many node modules directories for each package, or one for each package, and it ends up being sort of inefficient. So what you can do is you can run bootstrap with use workspaces as long as you set it up properly, and we'll talk about that. And you can create a script in your package JSON as well and simply call it bootstrap. So this allows you to run yarn bootstrap from now on, and it'll run npx Lerna bootstrap use workspaces. So how do we change to using Yarn Workspaces? Lerna.json, you change your npm client to Yarn and use workspaces as true. And then you also add where your packages are for workspaces. And then you just run Yarn per usual. So you can see that both of these things are extremely simple to set up, and they give you a pretty powerful way of like having the best of both worlds. In terms of being able to manage microservices, but also avoid the release hell that we talked about in terms of microservices. One thing I'll mention about Yarn too, there's Yarn versus npm is like one of those things that's always been a huge discussion. Yarn itself was born out of the need to have a more a more performant package manager. So what's interesting is that like right away when Yarn was released, it had a ton of performance issues, but ultimately figured them out. And for a brief moment was actually more performant than npm. npm's pretty much caught up now, and so it's really it's really preference at this point. So, yep. Let's talk about the future. I think this is where things get interesting, because this is how technology always works, right? Is you end up through cycles. You end up in sometimes a convoluted way of solving an issue or solving a problem. In this case, ending up with some options for these separate libraries that kind of change a little bit about how you work. And the way technology kind of moves forward is it starts offering you new solutions to those things that somebody somewhere thought was better, right? Bit was one of those things. And so it's a lot of work going into component collaboration tools like Bit. When used in conjunction with monorepos, these can be really powerful ways to share components more efficiently between packages. Really, what I want to talk about in terms of the future is something called module federation. And this is really awesome. I haven't gotten to really like implement it anywhere at work yet, but I think it's something that could really benefit benefit you in any role or position. Like if you're using it for something personal, using it at work, something like module federation is going to be huge. It's already in Webpack 5. So obviously monorepos present problems with scalability and can get resource hungry in the wild for sure. And what module federation does is it allows micro front ends to work more efficiently together and share their what module federation calls parts cross team. And this is also important, right? Because even if you're having like some sort of monorepo where like several teams are working on, you have like a ton of PRs and things, there's still easy ways to step on each other's toes. And so what module federation does is it allows you to start working with micro front ends, going back to microservices a bit, but really efficiently sharing parts between them. There's separate builds. So these parts are compiled as containers, which can be seamlessly consumed by other applications or containers. Because it's separate builds, it's good performance, and it may be a good solution for some people working on particularly large applications across multiple teams, when a monorepo with Lerna may not be as scalable for that context. And so this is something to keep an eye on for the future because it's also, like I said, it's already in Webpack 5, so it's not anything you're having to install separately or deal with separately. So something exciting. Okay. So I kind of included a quote here because I want to also discuss like the importance of being really careful, as you should be with any solution, of like not overusing it or using it incorrectly or just building things that you haven't designed well on top of other things that you haven't designed well. And so one of the first Lerna projects that I worked with was set up where there are two apps. The root AngularJS app was parallel with a second app in packages as that was Angular 6. And then in the packages directory was a bunch of components that both of them share that were in React, Angular 6, and AngularJS. And there wasn't a lot of like planning. Now it's, you can't really avoid those things all the time because maybe you started with one small app and we know that those things build on each other over time. So what I really want to caution with this is like, don't misuse your power. Don't build on top of poor design, push for the ability to design, go back to the drawing board and decide like, what's the best solution here and push back. It's not always realistic, but I think that sometimes it's easier for us to say like, I don't need to push back on this. I'll just build on top of something else. And more often than not, if you really present it well and you explain the importance of it to your manager or to a team, then people will sort of understand the importance of it. And I don't mean that, that's always the case, obviously. Like if you have a serious deadline for some other client or something, that's, you can't really avoid that all the time. But as much as possible, push for designing things the right way and not just building a monorepo on top of itself. So be contextually smart about how you architect your packages. So that's just a word of warning, if you will. So closing thoughts, I think, it's interesting to see the trajectory of and the history of how we've gotten here and where we're going with things like monorepos and being able to share components easily between micro front ends. And I hope that, if you're in a situation at work where you're or personally where you need to figure out how to share things and you don't want to do a monolith that's out of control and outdated, and you don't want to do a bunch of microservices that are unnecessarily cumbersome in terms of release, hopefully this is able to help you a little bit. So here's my contact information. Find me on LinkedIn too, and definitely let me know if you're looking for a job too. Not that tech systems is awesome also. Let me know if
Thanks
if
for
you
the
got
plug.
All right. All right.